Has the Arab Spring reached Tel Aviv, or is the class struggle in Israel taking a new turn? Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets against the high cost of living and demanding social justice. How deep is the social gap in Israel, and what is the likely impact of this mass protest on the Netanyahu government? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. It was billed as the mother of all demonstrations, but unlike the Arab Spring, Israelis weren't demanding democracy. More than 100,000 of them took to the streets unhappy with the state of their country, their grievance, rising prices and social injustice. Tom Ackerman in Jerusalem has more.
After the Arab Spring, this is Israel's summer. Here too, a peaceful mass uprising bringing 150,000 Israelis out into the streets of 6 cities on Saturday night. Their chant, "The people demand social justice."
For us, this is a revolution.
I think it's about getting fed up.
The protests have mushroomed since a few hundred young Israelis began camping out on urban boulevards to protest against the doubling of housing costs over the past 5 years. While Israel's poverty rate has been soaring, this is a movement driven by a wide spectrum of the middle class.
I'm working and paying everything, and in the end, I cannot pay the rent and I can pay for education, and the education of the children is not what I want, so I need to pay extra.
On Sunday, outside the Knesset, Israel's parliament, doctors who've shut down most public hospital services demanded Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's personal involvement in negotiations on wages and working conditions. Netanyahu's job approval rating is down to 32%. That's a sharp rebuke to a leader who's been quick to point out that the overall economy is thriving, that the jobless rate is down to a 27-year low, and that Israel's borders and interior are relatively safe. Netanyahu promised to pursue reforms, but warned against radical changes to Israel's free market system.
We need to avoid taking hasty, irresponsible, populist measures that could lead the economy to deteriorate, like European countries that have reached the verge of bankruptcy and massive unemployment.
But the critics say the Prime Minister is responsible for the discontent by presiding over Israel's steady shift from an egalitarian welfare state to one dominated by crony capitalists.
You have some large companies, monopoles, and some tycoons and people of finance that are reaping maybe more than their share.
Elections are still 2 years away, but unless Israel's borders heat up, it's the public souring on Netanyahu that will be his prime concern. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Jerusalem.
Well, let's take a closer look at this. Israel's level of economic inequality is one of the highest among developed countries. It is, in fact, 22% higher than in most OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This means almost 24% of Israelis live below the poverty line, the second highest, and that is 1 in every 4 people. The social groups most affected by this are the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who make up almost 57% of the most impoverished. Arab families follow close behind, accounting for almost 54%. Well, I'll be speaking to our panel of guests in Tel Aviv shortly, but first I'm joined by Mark Regev, the Israeli government spokesman in Jerusalem. Mr. Regev, thanks for being with us. Clearly a great deal of anger in Israel right now over a whole host of economic grievances, and the response from your government, they say, just hasn't been good enough.
Well, we've got an interesting situation in that, according to all the objective OECD data, the Israeli economy is moving ahead fine. Unemployment is at an all-time low. Growth is high, one of the highest in the OECD. We've sort of missed the global financial crisis that affected many of our neighbours in Europe and in North America. Israel,
yes, but while that's true,
Israel's economy, according to macro statistics,
those figures don't really illustrate the economic disparity, the great economic disparity that is apparent in Israel right now, because those OECD figures also show that it is among the worst among developed countries.
No, I think, to be fair, the economic situation is good, but we have a problem in that the cost of living in Israel is artificially high. We see that in the cost of consumer goods. We see that in the price of rental payments, buying houses. We have a problem that prices are too high in Israel. Now, some of this is an objective problem. You know, we're a very small country. We're one of the smallest countries on the planet. And we've got a growing population. Of course, you've got a situation where if land is scarce, the price for land is going to go up. But this has been accentuated. This problem has been strengthened by the fact that you've had an artificial situation that has prevented new housing construction. And what we're trying to do as a government is to increase the supply of housing, making more construction and therefore getting the prices down lower.
But the response that has come from your government so far, such as it is, Israelis are telling us simply hasn't been good enough because, and it's proving to be a major political headache for your Prime Minister, whose approval ratings have fallen to 32%. And really what they're saying is as long as these protests continue to grow and continue to get bigger, whatever the government has done so far simply hasn't been good enough.
Well, to be fair to my Prime Minister, he's been talking about this issue from well before it became fashionable. As 2 years ago, before anyone, Al Jazeera or anyone else was interested in the price of real estate in Israel, the Prime Minister had proposed on the table a comprehensive reform process that would lower the prices of housing in Israel by dealing with artificial state monopolies and so forth. Now with this public demonstration, we're hoping that will give us a bit of wind behind the proposals. We're pushing them through the Knesset. Now, there aren't immediate quick fixes here, but we think with right policies, we can get the prices of housing down lower.
But these are problems that have been growing for quite some time now, as you rightly say. But this particular government is now over 2 years into its 4-year term in office, and people are saying that they really should have seen this coming.
Well, I would argue that the government did. It wasn't only in the proposal on reforming the artificial state monopoly on land, which kept the prices high, but also on the issue of transportation. Israel's a very, very small country. And there's no reason we're so small geographically that if you improve public transportation, then you can get people to live outside the center of the country and they can come into work in the major financial and industrial centers. And so by improving public transportation, and here we've invested millions of shekels in road and in rail to make that situation so people can live out of the center of the country, Tel Aviv, and still come into work. And so these are the ideas. We have been dealing with these issues. There are no short-term solutions, but the whole idea that the government hasn't been dealing with these issues is simply not true. We have been dealing with them.
Well, people are also saying that you basically favor big business over everyone else. And to talk about the housing laws, for example, they say that they basically favor big developers by circumventing the checks and balances and fast-tracking the government approval for building. So why should they have to operate under a different set of laws than everybody else does?
No, Israel is a country of law and everyone has to operate under the same laws. But let's be clear here. The problem has been, and this is why the prices are so high, there's been demand and not enough supply. As I say, a small country with a very high growth rate in our population. And what we've got to do is we've got to build more housing for the population, and that'll bring the prices down. We've got one proposal that's already been started to implement. One of the problems is student housing. We don't have enough student dorms in Israel. It might sound like a small thing, but if we are building, and we plan to do it in the immediate future, building 10,000 student dorms, that's 20,000 young people leaving the rental market who can go to dormitories. That will allow automatically for rental prices to go down. That's a thing that the government can do immediately, and that can get prices down. We can also build more housing for small incomes, for families on lower incomes, and that way also deal with these problems. There are no quick fixes, but we think the right policy will get the prices down.
Well, we mentioned earlier that one of the groups that is really suffering the most are Arab Israelis. They've had their own grievances within Israel for years now. Is anything being done to address that?
I'm not sure that's true. You can see the Arab Israeli community is part of this demonstration because the housing shortage affects all Israelis across the board. And so we've got to deal with that issue. I'm not sure it's a special issue here for Arab Israelis. All I can tell you is I'm proud to say I live in a country where demonstrations are accepted, where demonstrations are almost routine. I live in a country where people are free to stand up and say they think the Prime Minister is wrong, that they live in a country where they think government policy is wrong. They can say so openly. And I'm glad to see we're seeing some of the same tendencies amongst our neighbours.
Mark Regev, Israeli government spokesman in Jerusalem, many thanks for your time. Well, joining us now for the second part of our discussion in Tel Aviv are our two guests. Roei Rutenberg, journalist and contributor for 972 Mag, an online news website dedicated to issues from Israel and the Palestinian territories. And also Libby Lenkinski, Director of International Relations for the Association of Civil Rights in Israel. Thanks for being with us, both of you. Roy Ruttenberg, if I could start with you. What is your impression of what we're seeing in Israel right now? Is this a real groundswell of protests that the government should be worried about?
Well, based on the most recent polls, the government at this point has nothing to worry about. Polled just recently by Tel Aviv University here in Israel has shown that Netanyahu, even if there's an election today, would still win. His right-of-center coalition would still hold the necessary 60-plus seats to keep the Knesset running and to keep his government in power. That's not to say that he shouldn't be concerned by this. And given the fact that there's been a high-level resignation in the Treasury Department, given the fact that we've seen some discord within members of his own coalition, given the fact that we've seen some tension and also a resignation from the finance ministry, the assistant to the finance minister himself, disagreeing very publicly with Yuval Steinitz, the finance minister, on how this is handled, that causes alarm within the coalition. But today, as it is, they are very strong, a very strong government. And as we've heard Tom Ackerman say, there are a number of reasons why the government here is strong, and that includes both safe borders as well as low level of unemployment, one of the lowest in the world given the recent global economic unrest.
Libby Linkinski, you agree with that assessment, or do you feel that the longer this goes on will put more pressure on the government right now?
That's a really good question. I can say that at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, together with the Coalition for Affordable Housing, we too have been working on issues of affordable housing on the policy level for some years now. And I have to say that to see this groundswell of popular support of Israelis that are demanding that these issues be resolved is actually very exciting. We can only hope that the grassroots involvement here will promote better policies in whatever form that can happen in.
Now, of course, Roy Ruttenberg, what we're seeing in Israel right now, there are, of course, the inevitable comparisons to the Arab Spring, and we mentioned that at the top, and you heard Tom Ackerman mention that in his report. But obviously, there are different grievances going on here. They're not calling for regime change. They're not calling for greater democracy. But they do have a lot of the same economic grievances that many people in the Arab world have, and perhaps the spirit of those protests are what inspired them here.
Indeed, I like Tom Ackerman's line, Arab Spring, Israeli Summer. I myself, before this housing protest began, wanted to write, actually was writing something called Arab Spring, Israeli Fall, because before this housing demonstration began, there was a very interesting law that passed in the Knesset. It was called the Anti-Boycott Law. I know Al Jazeera English covered it, and what it generated was a sudden wake-up call among the Israeli left, who are basically saying, wait, the government is telling us what we can't say and who we can't support. And even if many of them are opposed to boycott campaigns against Israel, they didn't like the fact that the government was now telling them that they can't support those campaigns. That was sort of a catalyst, which then immediately after that emerged this housing protest, where we saw one young woman leave her apartment, being unable to afford it, and essentially making camp in the streets of Tel Aviv. The difference between her turning homeless and essentially someone before her, the many who have turned homeless before her, was that she took her case to the public. She made it a Facebook campaign, and lots of people, angered by also this anti-boycott campaign, this anti-boycott law, joined her. They felt that there was that a right-wing government was essentially getting out of control. I have to say, I have the greatest of respect for ACRI, for the organization that Libby works for, and of course there's an excitement. It's good to see that people here are getting excited about these causes, but I guarantee you that ACRI, which has been following a number of social justice issues for years, would have been upset to see that people were not turning out in these numbers for other social justice issues as well. Now, of course, the issue is affordable housing, and one of my criticisms of this campaign has been it's definitely the right cause, but is it the right people? Meaning, are they getting involved a little too late? Should the international community and should the general public care about their concerns now that they're the ones who are suffering? And you drew the conclusion between the Arab world and the Israeli public, and one of the frustrations is that they're dealing with different types of government. In the Arab world, they're dealing with dictatorships. In Israel, people might look at them as a response and say, wait, they have a lot. They have education, they have good lives, they have decent incomes compared to some of the situations that the Arabs are dealing with, and they might say, look, don't try to compare yourselves to what the others are doing. Don't try to steal their momentum.
Libby Linkinski, you want to respond to that? Have people in Israel responded to this in the right way?
I think on the solidarity level, more than anything else, you can see drawing on terminology and some protest chants and things like that from the Arab Spring protests. If you walk down Rothschild Boulevard, which is now called Tent Boulevard, you can see lots and lots of references on signs to Tahrir Square and things like that. Just today, Dimi Ryder, also a blogger on 972, posted on Facebook a message from a Tahrir Square activist in solidarity with the Israeli protests. So I think on that level, I don't know if I would call it stealing the momentum as much as seeing what grassroots mobilization can really do, and Israelis getting mobilized on the issue that appears to be making them very fed up, which is affordable housing and wider social gaps.
Roy Rutenberg, I want to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned a little bit earlier, that how the grievances that average Israelis have when you said they have good education, good access to a lot of things like healthcare and so on, and that they pale in comparison to what Palestinians in the occupied territories are going through. How are they going to look at this, and how are people across the region going to look at this as they compare the two?
Well, when I was just a few hours ago, I was at one of these boulevards, which I believe Tom Ackerman also visited, and what I saw was a number of Israelis sitting around, reading the papers, resting in their tents. Some went off to work, some cutting vegetables, making salads, and then in the nearby distance were Palestinian Israeli city workers who sort of clean up the mess. There is an economic disparity here, that's clear, but for many years, one of the criticisms has been that people are blind to the real social injustice until it affects them. I have to say, it's very unpopular to criticize a popular movement, and I have no criticism of the causes that these people are fighting for, but I do criticize what I call, what I would say, or some would say, is a little bit too little, too late. Meaning, you have to look at the larger structure within Israel. These are the very same people who, because of security issues, voted repeatedly conservative governments into power without actually checking their conservative economic policies, and years later, they're paying the price for that. It's very. So
you're saying basically that this is a mess of their own making to some extent?
Well, you have to look at the infrastructure of the Israeli political system. In Israel, social politics. Within Israel, you've got a number of political parties, some 30 political parties, all of them fighting for a small number of votes to make a coalition. As a result, you get sort of what are called one-issues parties. Sometimes the one issues actually join to make two issues for one party. A recent election had a senior citizen party and a pro-marijuana party joined together, which was sort of an odd, and they actually did not meet a threshold. However, what happened is, let's take a look at the a party of Israel Beitenu, the party of the Israeli foreign minister Avigdor Lieberman. His party came to strength on a completely social issue, which was civil marriages, because a lot of people refused to marry under the religious courts. And he was specifically appealing towards Russian Jews who had moved to Israel and found it really difficult to marry under the rabbinic court laws. That was a very social issue, a very progressive social issue for civil marriages, and his party got one of the biggest votes in the election. As a result, he became the foreign minister, and suddenly he's been tasked with dealing with foreign policy issues when in fact his platform had nothing to do with foreign policy. I've advocated for a while of political reform in Israel to actually be able to make any progress with the Palestinians and to make any progress in a number of social reforms that need to happen here. And you can't do that when the political system is constantly hijacked by what I consider to be a broke electoral system.
Libby Linkinski, is it the system that is at fault here?
Absolutely. I actually agree with one of the points that Roe made with regards to the connections and the sort of narrowness of the scope of this particular protest movement. But I think, when you scratch below the surface of government spending and you look at the budget, it's very clear where the money is going, and it's not to social services. And so I think that's something that the protesters themselves have not put up front, but I do think that it's lurking there. And it's a very important subtext to all of what we see going on.
All right, I want to give you a flavor now of what Israelis on the streets are saying. There's, it appears that they share the same anger for the government, and here's what some of them had to say.
Unfortunately, here in Israel, we have a great economy from one hand, but from the other hand, you can really live with your salary, as you know, as the simple citizen can't really live here.
We can't afford sending our son to kindergarten and affording to buy diapers and food and we take money from our parents and they don't have enough money to help us.
I'm protesting against many things, but now it's against the prices. Like all things around babies is so expensive.
I'm here with many other thousands of Israelis to protest against the neoliberal and capitalist government of Bibi Netanyahu that's choking working class and middle class families and young people and old people, Jews and Arabs are choking under economic burden.
I am here together with these wonderful people to cry out the cry of all the sectors in the Israeli public that have become the servants of the tycoons and their friends in the Knesset.
So just a flavour of what Israelis are saying there. I want to let you know that we spoke to Mark Regev a little earlier in the programme, and he said that the government has listened to these concerns and is addressing them and has actually flagged them up for some time now. But because of the protests have grown to this size, it is an opportunity for them to really address this seriously. But should these protests continue, what implications are they going to have for Israel the longer they go on, Rowie?
Well, the ruling Likud party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud party, has never won an election based on social issues, meaning every time the agenda was one about social inequality, the left would win. The only way the Likud wins is when an issue of security comes up. We've seen it happen with the Intifada in the past. So the elections are scheduled for 2013. Netanyahu is hoping to carry the coalition government until that time. If the elections were held today, his support would still have him sit through. But if this continues for another year, for another 6 months, and there is some type of recall vote, a vote of no confidence, it's unclear how long he can keep up the momentum, as long as there is no security issue. Of course, if he, quote, wags the dog, as they say in America, and therefore creates some type of diversion, be it with a conflict with the Palestinians, with Iran, or even if he does something incredibly popular, like secures the release of the Israeli corporal Gilad Shalit, held by Hamas for a number of years, that would change the public tide.
Libby Linkinski, you concur with that?
I do, to a certain extent. I think that what Mark Regev was referring to earlier was also specific policies that Prime Minister Netanyahu announced last week to do with housing. Namely the National Housing Committee's law, which would allow big projects to circumvent the usual bureaucratic procedures according to Israeli building and planning law in order to fast track and get approved and built. Of course, we're against this because that bureaucratic process allows for important checks and balances and public involvement in housing decisions. And we feel that the Prime Minister's office is spinning this, the National Housing Committee's law. We're hoping that the continued groundswell crying out for closing social gaps will inspire change in those policies, much needed change.
Rowie, do you think it's fair to say that it's really the middle class that is bearing the brunt of this? I mean, we saw in those protests quite a wide spectrum of people, but it is essentially people in the middle income that are really taking the brunt of all of this, isn't it?
Well, what you've seen during the recent global crunch, the global economic crisis, was that the wealthy class actually strengthened in Israel. You have some 27 families owning 40% of the wealth. The poor class became poorer, and the poor class became larger, and the middle class was sort of squeezed out. Israel has conservative economic policies. It has in its bank Governor Stanley Fischer, who was at one time a possible candidate to head the IMF. Very, very conservative fiscal policies, which Israel bragged about as helping carry it through the economic recession. But as you see now, Israelis, not just the middle class, but Israelis that are feeling the pinch of even basic food staple prices going up by 60%, are starting to say we've had enough. We can no longer afford our basic lives.
All right, we are going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank both of you for taking part in the discussion. My thanks to Roy Rutenberg and Libby Linkinski in Tel Aviv. Many thanks for your time. And also want to thank Mark Regev, who joined us a little earlier, government spokesman in Jerusalem. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Remember, you can email them to us anytime at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.